Welcome to our educational series. My name is Mark Newman. I'm the president and founder of Precision Analytical, the makers of the Dutch test. And in this session, we're going to go over some of the basics that we need to know regarding laboratory testing. So we're going to talk about just the basics of laboratory testing, specifically for hormones. We're going to look at the pros and cons of serum, saliva, and urine testing. All three of these have their place and should be a tool in your practice. And we're going to talk about where those excel and where some of those limitations are. We're also going to differentiate between different methods. And what we mean by that is, for which methods can I just kind of use whatever I want because it's a commodity, it's easy to do, and in which situations do I need to be careful to make sure I'm getting an LCMS assay or some of the differentiations between the available methods that we have in the marketplace. Now, when we're talking about functional endocrinology, you're going to be looking at hormones that are within and outside of the scope of the Dutch test that we do. So the entirety of functional endocrinology is also going to include not just the adrenal and the sex or reproductive hormones, but also the thyroid, of course, and insulin and things related to blood sugar control. And we want to consider all of these, and we will be discussing many of these in our educational series, but our focus is going to be within this series on the adrenal and reproductive or sex hormones that make up the Dutch test. When it comes to hormone testing, the first rule that we tend to live by is that most things default to blood testing. So unless we're compelled to look elsewhere for these types of hormones, we're going to start with blood testing. So you're going to hear this mantra repeatedly because I think it's helpful that serum is the default when we're talking about hormones. Cortisol drives us to using saliva, and the comprehensiveness of what we can measure in urine is what drives us to include that in our tools for hormone testing. So serum is the default, cortisol will drive us to saliva, and comprehensiveness will drive us to urine testing. And we're going to talk about all three of those within this talk and also within our whole educational series. So when we're looking at, just as an example, thyroid, things like insulin, there's really no reason to go outside of a blood test. You can look at some of these things historically that have been done in a saliva sample, some of it in urine, some of it in blood spot. And these tests, really, unless you have a reason to do another type of test, maybe you can't get a blood draw or something like that, there's just no reason to go outside of standard blood testing. And when you're doing those standard blood tests, the panel that you run will differ from other providers, but you're going to include these types of things, generally looking at thyroid and insulin and maybe leptin, SHBG, and we'll talk about some of these throughout, but we're mostly focusing outside of this list, again, on the adrenal and the sex hormones or the reproductive hormones. When we move into the adrenal and the reproductive hormones, you can really still live by this rule that blood testing tends to be a pretty good place to start. And generally, when you're looking at most of the hormones that we test other than cortisol, blood testing actually works pretty well. So a serum test for DHEAS, progesterone, estradiol, testosterone, those are pretty good tests. There are some HRT situations where serum may not be the best option, and we'll talk about those situations in a future video session, but blood testing is fine for these hormones when we're talking about baseline testing. So serum, saliva, and urine, when we're talking about sex hormones, they're not all the same. You should get generally the same information. People that tend to be low in one test should be low in another. Someone who has an elevation, you can probably pick it up in all three of those tests. But let's look a little bit at what we're actually measuring because it is different. The hormones, when they're made, let's take an estrogen, it's made by the ovary. That hormone is made as a free hormone, and then it circulates not as a free hormone, but bound to a binding protein. And it's that complex, the binding protein. So if we're talking about estradiol, it's generally bound to either albumin or sex hormone binding globulin. And only a little bit of it, maybe 2%, is free. It's that complex of the hormone and the binding protein that we're mostly measuring when we look at serum testing. Now, when we look at salivary testing, it's a little bit different. The free hormone is able to slide into the saliva, which is why the levels are so much lower there, and the the hormone, as it's bound to the protein, which is most of, again, what's circulating, is not able to get into the saliva gland. So only the free hormone gets into the saliva gland. Now, what about urine testing? Now, in urine testing, that free hormone, if we're talking about a sex hormone, so estradiol, can it get into urine? No, it's not water soluble enough. So the liver, as part of phase 2 metabolism, is going to add a water soluble group onto that hormone. And again, if it's estradiol, now it's estradiol glucuronide, that water soluble form. That's what is allowed to get into the urine. Now, it's not available to become conjugated unless it's bioavailable, unless it's free, right? So urine becomes a pretty good surrogate for bioavailable hormone. But the take home message here is that these three measurements, while they tend to parallel each other, are actually measuring something that's different in terms of the physical measurement. So protein bound, free hormone, and conjugated hormones. So they're in different forms, but again, the results should generally correlate. Now, one of the reasons that one might choose a urine test over a serum test is that the hormone levels actually can fluctuate quite a bit throughout the day. So if you look at this particular patient, this is from a research study that was published. This woman's levels of progesterone are getting down to around 6. So it's very clear that she's ovulated. You would not have a serum progesterone above 5 if you didn't ovulate. But 5 and 6 is a little on the low side, whereas 35 and 36 is a really, really strong progesterone, potentially even outside of the reference range on the high end. And throughout the day, she's fluctuating between these two extremes. The urine testing, if you collect a 24-hour urine, it's going to include, of course, the entirety of the day. But even with the Dutch test, we're looking at 4 samples taken throughout the day. So one of them represents the entirety of the overnight period, and then the B sample represents the early morning, and then there's another one in the afternoon, and one collected right at bedtime. So between those 4, you're really doing a much better job of averaging out the highs and lows. Again, serum and urine can both be used successfully to monitor progesterone, but one of the advantages of a urine test is that it's going to average out those highs and lows. To summarize what we're looking at here, saliva is going to have your free hormone, and there's not very much of that. In serum, you do have a little bit of free hormone you can see there in the lower left, but it's predominantly protein bound. So again, only about 2% of it is free. You're measuring the total. So generally the information you're getting is about that total hormone and binding protein complex that you see. And then in the urine, there's a little bit of free hormone you can see there, and then most of it is conjugated. So serum is the default, as we've said. However, because those binding proteins are so important, as the levels of those go up, so sex hormone binding globulin, if the levels of that are elevated, then it's going to reduce the amount of free or bioavailable hormone that you have. So when you're using a serum, and only a serum test, for things like estradiol and testosterone, both of which bind to SHBG, you're going to want to add SHBG into your testing menu when you're looking at serum. Again, cortisol is going to drive us to saliva, and that's something that we need to discuss in greater detail. But before we get there, we do want to say that there is a reason to choose serum or urine over saliva when it comes to the sex hormones, and that's because it's just not as powerful analytically, meaning it doesn't do nearly as good a job of separating the hormone sufficient from the hormone deficient, which brings me to rule number 2 for hormone testing. Significant validation needs to be seen before you abandon a gold standard method. So for things like estradiol, serum is considered our gold standard. And the commercially available method that we have for saliva or for urine must correlate well to that gold standard serum method before we're going to really consider using that in our practice. And that's where we have some trouble with particularly estradiol. The estradiol levels are very low in saliva. When we look at the only commercially available published data, we can see that the correlation between plasma, which is going to give you the same information as serum, and saliva is really not a very strong correlation. Now, that's not to say that the information within saliva is not correlating well to serum, but the measurement is just very difficult. So we did a little study where we took estradiol values, and we measured them in serum, we measured them in urine and saliva. We grouped them into these four groups. So we had a group of postmenopausal women, so you can see the very low estrogen levels here, and then women throughout the cycle. So where we tend to measure women is in this luteal phase, which is around day 19, 20, 21, where you get this moderate level of estrogen. Now, if you test around ovulation, or for a pregnant patient, you're going to get much higher levels of estradiol. And if you test in the first 6 or 7 days of the cycle, you're going to get moderately lower values. The point here is that the values we see in serum follow the pattern that we know exists in physiology. Very low levels in postmenopausal, and then throughout the cycle, moderately low levels in the follicular phase. Then you get very high levels in the ovulatory phase, and then these modestly elevated values in the luteal phase. So we're testing generally in the luteal phase. And if you get values down in here, you may have some sort of deficiency. Maybe if it's low enough, even ovarian failure. And if we get values closer to a pregnant person or someone at ovulation, then maybe we have excess estrogen. But when we compare this same data to samples collected on the same day and then sent to, in this case, we sent it to 7 different saliva labs to see if we could get the same type of differentiation. And the best data that we got showed with these commercially available assays that you start to pull apart these elevations from what we'll call the normal levels in the luteal phase, but you're not able to well differentiate the postmenopausal or the estrogen deficient from the estrogen sufficient luteal phase. And that's really important because that's the point of a lab test, right? Is we want to differentiate the people who have sufficient hormone from those that have abnormal levels. Now, you can find in the literature that there is data, particularly this 1990 Wong paper, shows pretty decent serum and saliva correlation when we look at estradiol. But what we need to know about this is that this method is about, just guessing, about 10 to 20 times more sensitive than most commercially available assays because they're using a method that's not very easy to automate. And it's not a method that anyone is using that I'm aware of in commercially available assays. The other thing with this study is it's all premenopausal women. So we want to also show, and this method may have worked well down into this postmenopausal range, but that wasn't the point of the study. The study on the right is just another study that's recent, not a commercially available assay, and also measuring really high levels of estradiol, but you can see really similar patterns in saliva and serum. So it is possible to get a good number out of saliva to monitor someone's estradiol, but with the commercially available assays, we really need to see more validation data that shows that strong correlation before that really becomes a good option and a strong analytical tool. Now, we repeated all of this sort of validation data with urine testing, with the Dutch test, and what we found is a very nice distinction between the hormone deficient and the hormone sufficient crowd. And so we took that data and actually published the serum correlation, which showed essentially statistical equivalence between the estradiol and the progesterone metabolites measured in the urine as compared to serum testing. We also looked at our 4-spot method and showed statistical equivalence to a 24-hour urine collection, which is the classic gold standard method for urine when looking at estradiol and progesterone. And then we also looked at dried versus liquid urine testing to show that, again, there's equivalence there. So really nice validation data showing that when we look at serum and when we look at urine, we get really similar patterns so that we're able to use either one of these tests, serum or urine, to measure these hormones. The reason we might defer to a urine test in some situations, such as the Dutch test, is it allows you to go further, right? We're not just looking at estradiol, we're able to look at estrone and estriol and 2-hydroxy and 4-hydroxy and 16-hydroxy estrogens and methylation products, the methylated estrogen. So we're looking at not just the hormone, but phase 1 and phase 2 metabolites. So it's that comprehensiveness, again, that urine provides that is beneficial. Before we go further, let's just talk a little bit about choosing the right testing methods, specifically within blood testing. Within blood testing, we want to make sure that we're picking the right methods when it matters. So I want to break this into 2 different groups. One being a situation where the testing method does matter, and in others where generally most labs and most lab tests and methodologies are able to do a pretty good job. So that sounds a lot like a commodity to me. So we'll call these commodity lab testing. So when you're looking at tests that are generally only done in blood, for example, LH, FSH, and we're looking at steroid hormones at high concentrations like cortisol and DHEA, if we measure them in blood, it doesn't tend to matter what type of method the laboratory uses. They tend to do a pretty good job. So here's just an example. The Mayo Clinic offers DHEAS testing. It's an immunoassay. um, that's going to be a good test. If we switch over to LabCorp and we're looking at DHEAS, we see that, hey, within 1 day, which is great turnaround time, we can look at an immunoassay for DHEAS. Now, if we want a more sophisticated test, we can look at DHEAS from the same lab, but now they're using LCMS. Now we're going to pay for that, right? Generally, it's going to cost a little bit more, and you can see the turnaround time is no longer a day, it's 5 to 10 days. But in this particular situation with DHEAS, you should be getting pretty much the same information either way. So I'm going to call this a commodity, right? So we have commodity testing, and then we have non-commodity, where we really need to be careful about the methods that we're using. And within the world of reproductive and adrenal hormones, progesterone to some degree, but especially testosterone and estradiol, it really matters which type of testing that you want to use. So testosterone and estradiol are the two most common tests for which testing methods must be chosen carefully, but particularly at low concentrations. So let me show you what methods we have available. So not advanced methods. These would be just your typical, the hospital I work at has its own laboratory and they do what sort of testing? Usually it's an ELISA, or it can also be called an EIA or an immunoassay. They work fine. But when you get down to low levels of estradiol and testosterone, they can be problematic, which is where you want to be careful and choose generally a more advanced method. Today, most people are going with LC-MS-MS methods for that, but you can also use an older version of the more advanced method would be an ultra sensitive. I'm not going to get into the details of what that is, but it's just a better way of testing the lower levels. We can see in this publication, they talk about these sort of standard types of assays, these immunoassays, lacking accuracy to measure very low serum estradiol levels, and that's important. Here's the actual data. Okay, when we look at a premenopausal woman for estradiol, she's going to be up in these higher levels. And when we look at the advanced method on the x-axis, that's the LCMS-MS method, and we look at this given immunoassay, you get pretty good numbers, right? But that correlation is strong. But when you really zoom in, and we can see that over here on the right, the correlation falls apart a little bit at the low end because this immunoassay isn't really accurate enough at those low levels. So it's when you get into this postmenopausal range that you're better off looking at an LC-MS-MS. And that would probably be true as well of men and children if you're trying to test estradiol. So this is where you need LC-MS-MS for both testosterone and estradiol. Let's look at the testosterone data just briefly. Most men are going to be up here. And I would guess in this study that these are the men, and then down here you can see that's probably either men who have some sort of issue going on where they're not making testosterone like they're supposed to, or more likely it's women. I don't remember specifically what they were looking at in this study, but when you get down to those low levels, again, this correlation breaks down because the immunoassay is not strong enough. So for estradiol and testosterone at the low end, so that'd be for women for testosterone, for men, for postmenopausal women and children for estradiol, you're better off choosing an LC-MS-MS assay when you're using a serum assay. And you say, oh, it's better. Well, let's use that for everything. You can, but when you get to DHEAS, just as an example, if you look at this correlation, it's beautiful, right? So the LCMS-MS assay or this particular immunoassay, they both give you essentially an equivalent number. Now, if we compare these two, DHEAS and estradiol, why does DHEAS work so much better? Well, when you look at 1,000 on estradiol, which is way off the chart, right? These are all much lower than 1,000. 1,000 here on the right for estradiol represents in the same units less than zero point 0.1 for DHEA-S. So those hormones are in great abundance. They're easy to measure. The estradiol is also relatively easy to measure once you're over, say, 50 or 100. But again, it's those low levels where you want to pick your more accurate method. Now, that's the method. What about the samples? We've talked about this a little bit, but which samples should we be deferring to when we're wanting these measurements? Again, serum is your default. Cortisol is going to drive us to saliva and comprehensiveness to urine. So we talked about rule number 1, test in blood unless compelled to do otherwise, right? That's where cortisol lives. Saliva testing is not only shown to be a good alternative to blood testing, it's actually preferred. So cortisol drives us to saliva. We should be measuring in saliva free. And if we want to look at that diurnal up and down pattern of cortisol, so it's going to be highest in the early morning and then drop off during the day. And we don't just want one number generally for cortisol. We want to see this daily pattern that it has. And you can look at that in cortisol's free form, so the bioactive form, in either saliva or urine, right? But we can't really look at that in serum. Now, here are some literature references if you'd like to dig into that a little bit and see what the literature has to say, but it's a pretty good consensus that that is true. When we look at the steroid hormones, so we can see these all generally have the same sort of backbone to them. That's what makes them a steroid, right? And then these functional groups change from one hormone to another. You can see the distinction between progesterone and estradiol on both sides of the molecule there. Those distinctions are what give them their clinical impact, that they're a little bit different. And what we can see is cortisol is pretty different than these others. If we look at all these functional groups out here and throughout the molecule, what that's doing is making cortisol much more water soluble, which is going to make it behave a little bit differently than the rest. So when the adrenal gland makes this hormone, when it makes cortisol, yes, we're going to get much of it protein bound. Okay, and then that protein bound hormone is going to end up in the serum. And it's the free hormone, again, that circulates and ends up in the saliva. Now, here's where we get a distinction between the sex hormones and cortisol. Cortisol can, because it's so much more water soluble, actually find its way into urine. So while we are looking at hormone conjugates in urine for the sex hormones, we're actually looking at free cortisol. So it's the same type of measurement in saliva or urine. The free cortisol is what we're measuring. So when we want to look at our various measurements and we've got our lab test, saliva cortisol, we're looking at what? Free hormone, but there's quite a bit of it. So it's a relatively easy lab test for us to do. When we look at salivary estradiol, as we mentioned, there's just not very much of it, which is what makes it a very difficult lab test. Now, when we look at serum, this is a pretty easy measurement for most of these hormones. We're looking at the total of these protein bound and free hormones. Now, here's where we get into a distinction in urine. We've got hormone conjugates, right? That's the water soluble version of a hormone. And for cortisol, there's actually quite a bit of free cortisol. So with something like testosterone, only 1% is going to be free in the urine. It's essentially negligible, and we don't worry about it. It's not an easy measurement to make. When we're talking about cortisol in urine, about a third of it is free, and all of the scientific literature for urine is based on free cortisol, and that's what we want to measure, right? So for cortisol, we're leaving those hormone conjugates behind and just looking at the free hormone. Now, if you want to know how the lab testing actually works for the sex hormones, what we do is we know we've got a bunch of glucuronides and sulfates. That is that little green dot represents the water-soluble conjugate that makes it a hormone conjugate. So it just so happens that a certain species of snail has a whole bunch of glucuronidase and sulfatase in its system. And so we actually use an extract from that. The snail actually removes, the product from the snail actually removes those conjugate groups, leaving the hormone in its original form, the free hormone, after that treatment in the lab. And then that is what the lab test is actually measuring, which is, again, a good reflection of bioavailable hormone or systemic hormone. Now, when we're talking about cortisol and saliva. We can also use urine again for that up and down pattern, but we don't get the cortisol awakening response out of urine, which is a big advantage for saliva, which is why saliva is the gold standard when it comes to free cortisol. And we'll talk about that in more detail in later talks. But we want to be looking at free cortisol, and we want to look at this meaningful up and down pattern that it has. Now, let's just talk briefly so we know, why don't we use serum testing to measure cortisol? Yes, it's true that you can't easily look at the up and down pattern, but the bigger problem is that you're measuring total cortisol and not free cortisol. So let me show you why that's important. Let's say we have a female patient who has a representative amount of the hormone, so in this case cortisol, in serum, which again there it's going to be what? Protein bound, right? In saliva, you're going to get a representative amount of free cortisol and then a representative amount of free cortisol in urine. Now let's say we take that patient and we put them on birth control. Okay, now what happens when we put someone on birth control is the hormone in the birth control, watch the serum here, is we're going to increase the amount of binding protein that's in the serum, and the body's pretty smart. The stress response is pretty smart. So it's going to make more cortisol to fill up those spots. And if the stress response doesn't change, is the amount of cortisol in saliva or urine going to change? No. So when we're done with this whole situation, what you have is the amount of cortisol that you're measuring in serum is, it might double, let's say. Okay, but that's not really a change in the stress response. That's not really a change in the tissue exposure or burden as it relates to cortisol. So the saliva and the urine-free cortisol are going to hold steady here, and that's a better representation of this patient's cortisol status than looking at that increased value in serum. So that's just an example that we can give to highlight why we want to measure free cortisol and not total cortisol. So yes, there's some clinical utility of looking at cortisol in serum while you're doing all of your other serum measurements, but it really doesn't give you the type of clinical power that you're going to get in either saliva or in urine. So again, we can use either saliva or urine to measure free cortisol, but saliva really does the best job. The urine testing is going to give us a look at that up and down picture of cortisol, and that's good. But where urine really excels is in all the other things that we can look at. Urine testing can add metabolite measurements to cortisol, to estrogen, to the androgens, and that really gives us a much more comprehensive look at what's going on with the patient. So when we look at the Dutch test was originally meant to look at estrogen, but comprehensively, not just estrogen production like you can see in serum, but also that phase 1 metabolism and methylation. Similarly with testosterone and DHEA, we're looking at production, but we're also looking at the metabolites. We can look at progesterone, and for cortisol, we're seeing the free pattern, which is good to see, and also production, which is best measured by looking at the metabolites. So we're able to get a pretty complete look at cortisol. Over the last few years, we've filled in the Dutch test with some complementary markers. So we now measure two markers in urine that if they are elevated, it implies you have a B6 deficiency. Also another marker, methylmalonic acid, which people are familiar with, that if it's elevated, you may have a B12 deficiency. Another marker for glutathione deficiency, two markers for neurotransmitter balance, oxidative stress, 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine is a marker for oxidative stress, and we can also look at melatonin production. Just as an example of the value of some of these markers, 8-hydroxy 2-deoxyguanosine, that's our marker for oxidative stress. When we're looking at, let's take a topic like breast cancer. The levels of this marker tend to be elevated. It is not a definitive diagnostic tool for breast cancer by any means, but it gives us some added information as we deal with things like risk for breast cancer because it tends to be higher in people with breast cancer. And you can see here from this study, the levels of people who have a malignant breast tumor or even a benign tumor are significantly higher than people without. A pretty strong distinction. We can also look, if we're just going to continue this thought of one particular risk like breast cancer, we have a lot of things on the Dutch test that actually speak to that. So the 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine tends to be higher. The melatonin marker that we measure tends to be lower in breast cancer risk. We can move on and look at estrogen metabolites, which also relate to breast cancer risk. Cortisol patterns may relate to breast cancer risk. So that's where the comprehensiveness really adds value when we're looking at a urine test like the Dutch test. When comparing Dutch test to a serum is going to do a good job of giving you information on a few of these hormones, but again, it's not as comprehensive. So when functional medicine providers have approached hormones, they tend to start with serum for estrogen, testosterone, DHEA, and progesterone, and then add a saliva test to look at that up and down pattern and also the cortisol awakening response. And that's where, when we're looking at the comprehensiveness of urine testing, comprehensiveness really is what drove the development of the Dutch test, is finding one model of testing where we can look at all of these markers in one easy to collect test. And that can be a powerful tool for you in your practice. So the Dutch test includes all of these urine markers, and in addition, when we look at the Dutch Plus, we also get to add in the cortisol awakening response. So the Dutch Complete is going to look at all of these things on the left in one easy to do test with these dried urine collections. If we look at the Dutch Plus, now we're adding to the dried urine the salivary collection, which again allows us a look at that up and down pattern, which we can see in either, but also gives us an even more detailed look at the HPA axis and cortisol by looking at the cortisol awakening response, which we will talk about in more detail in other videos. Precision Analytical offers the Dutch Complete and the Dutch Plus as our most comprehensive way to look at hormones. We also offer just the free cortisol pattern throughout the day in the Dutch Car Kit. So we're looking at the cortisol awakening response by looking at a sample at waking and 30 minutes later. There's also a sample 60 minutes after waking and dinner and bedtime to give the entirety of that daily curve, but also the ability to look at the cortisol awakening response. And if for premenopausal women, you have a desire to look at data throughout the cycle, the Dutch cycle mapping offers a really rich set of data of looking at the things that we normally see in the Dutch Complete, but also adding in that up and down pattern of both estrogen and progesterone throughout the menstrual cycle. So there are collections throughout the cycle, and then we look at the 9 most relevant measurements to really well characterize both the ovulatory peak and the luteal peak, looking again at estrogen and progesterone patterns throughout the month. In studying and using functional endocrinology in your practice, what you'll find is that combining the Dutch test for all its comprehensiveness with your serum testing, putting those two together really gives you the information that you need to make most decisions. And throughout this educational series, we're going to be looking at how you combine these two, the measurements in blood, the measurements of Dutch, as well as treatment strategies. We're going to put all that together and really provide some great information for you in your practice. But before I wrap up, let me just add in hormone testing rule number 3. That's a little bit of a sidestep from what we've been talking about, and that is just a disclaimer for all lab tests, is that lab tests are made by humans and performed by humans, and they all have limitations, and we need to understand that all lab tests can occasionally mislead. Let me just give you one anecdote that might help sort of crystallize what I'm saying. 25 hydroxy vitamin D is your best marker for vitamin D status, right? And if we look through the lab testing, we can see that there are immunoassays, there are LCMS assays, and we can discuss which one's better. Most people would say that an LCMS assay is the gold standard. Great. So if we choose that method, that's a really good tool. However, if you look at a newborn babies, a fraction of them have what's called an epimer of 25 hydroxy vitamin D3. So it looks really similar to 25 hydroxy vitamin D, but it's a little bit different. And when you look at this quote gold standard method, it actually doesn't differentiate between those two. So there's a little bit of a caveat when you test newborns, which again is, it's not a very common measurement to make. But when we get into this little esoteric niche, what we find is that the lab has to be aware that you can get misleading information in this very specific situation. Why? Not because there is something wrong with the way these tests are developed. It's just a limitation of this gold standard method. And every method that you will use has some situations where the information might be misleading. So we want to start off by making sure that we're using the highest quality testing. At Precision Analytical, we have developed all of the tests that we do in multiple ways, multiple methods. So we've developed tests using GCM-SMS, using LCM-SMS. We've done experimenting with immunoassays, and what we've done is pick the best method for each test. So just as an example for us, we test the reproductive hormones and their metabolites by GCM-SMS, which tends to be the most specific and accurate for those, but it's not quite as good for cortisol. So cortisol and other related compounds, as well as the organic acids and some of our other markers, we test by LC-MS-MS. So we want to use high quality testing. We want to understand the limitations of each, and we're going to get into some of the limitations of serum testing and urine testing throughout this educational series so that we can be well educated on what the limitations of each test are. And lastly, be slow to treat based on any lab when the clinical picture does not align. So we want to be overlaying the clinical picture with the laboratory values, and sometimes the laboratory values will reshape our understanding of the clinical picture, but you also will find the occasional situation where there is a mismatch there, and we want to move slowly in those situations and be in conversations with the laboratory to make sure that we're making the best decisions that we can. Ahead of you in this educational series, we're going to be looking at a lot of information on how to use serum testing and Dutch testing in your clinical practice, looking at female hormones, male hormones, also looking at the metabolites of estrogens and androgens and cortisol, and looking in more detail at the adrenal hormones. And then lastly, we'll be looking at hormone replacement therapy. How do we do that successfully, and how do we monitor that successfully with the combinations of testing that we have available. So thank you for your time, and we look forward to more education to come.